going to share the first slide as we talked about. And we're going to have, what am I looking at here? I'm looking at the participants. It's going up. The live stream is up and running. And in this case, since we're running short on time, I'm going to welcome everybody to their attendance today. Because of the particulars of everybody's time commitment, we're going to turn it over to our first guest speaker, and that's General Wesley Clark. He's going to actually drop off our connection a little later and come back on. But we're going to give him the opportunity to speak first, and then we'll go with our traditional opening. So, General, please feel free to speak right now.
Well, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be on here with my good friend and compatriot Phil Carver. We were in Ukraine first in 2014, right after Maidan, and obviously we followed it very closely since and made multiple trips. Phil's made more than I have. I was last in Ukraine in September. But I want to talk about just a couple of things by way of introduction to what Phil's going to cover. First, to tell you that historically, and especially since the 20th century, wars are ended normally by some kind of diplomacy. It could be an armistice. It could be a surrender document. Only in rare cases is there no formal end to a conflict. And when there is no formal end, that generally means you're going to have a continuing problem. So when you move to end it by negotiations or diplomacy, the outcome normally reflects the outcome on the battlefield. And so it's there's two ways to approach it. You can approach it with decisive force, in which case you're just going to overrun the enemy. If he surrenders before you overrun him, that's great. If you don't, he's gone. We Americans used decisive force in the 2003 Gulf War. Saddam Hussein never had a chance to really surrender. He was just run out, and we occupied the country. We used decisive force in World War II against Nazi Germany and against Japan. In both cases, in the case of Nazi Germany, they were totally occupied. In the case of Japan, the use of the nuclear weapon assured that they would come and sign the surrender documents. The other way to succeed before you have to use decisive force is escalation dominance. You simply persuade the adversary that it's in his best interest to surrender sooner rather than later, because the longer the war goes on, the more he has to lose relative to you. This is the mechanism we used in Kosovo in 1999. We started with only a few airstrikes. Milosevic tried to strike back. We escalated the airstrikes. We planned for a ground invasion, and we gave him a way out with a diplomatic process. And ultimately, he realized that if he didn't surrender sooner rather than later, he was going to lose a lot more. And so it went on for 78 days. Escalation dominance helped us prevail. In the case of Kosovo, of Ukraine right now, what we're seeing is, from the standpoint of the West is done a marvelous job, I think, in showing consensus, showing strength and determination to Russia. We provided $120 billion worth of assistance to Ukraine. Sounds like a lot. But what hasn't been shown by the West is a strategy for ending the war successfully. Instead, it's as though we're keeping the war going. It's what one Western leader said, well, we want to be responsive to the battlefield. Well, being responsive to the battlefield means you're always a step or two behind. And that's not a winning strategy in conflict. So what would a winning strategy be? Well, you have to understand that negotiations reflect the outcome on the battlefield, or the threatened outcome on the battlefield. that you have to resource and plan for that outcome in order to get the outcome diplomatically that would end the conflict. And in the case of Ukraine, the decisive objective that efforts must be aimed at is Crimea. Crimea is what Putin values the most. When it's threatened or threatened to be lost, he will come to the table, if not to surrender, but to get as much as he can before he loses it. And so this is the military objective that has to be resourced. We need to give Ukraine what it needs to successfully attack and take Crimea. And then let's see what happens. We also need to take the leadership in putting out the right end state, and we need to make no bones about it. This is what we're asking. Mr. Putin, pull all your forces out of Ukraine. Mr. Putin, account for all of those abducted, murdered, or otherwise killed by your forces. Mr. Putin, plan for reparations. And by the way, we hold you accountable. Those four elements would provide the basis for the opening round of diplomacy. And after that, we'll get to the hard part. How much negotiations? What security guarantees? Will Ukraine be in NATO? But first, out you go, Mr. Putin. And we're going to provide the resources necessary for Ukraine to make sure that happens. That's the surest way to end this war and end it quickly. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Phil Carver. Phil, please.
Thank you, Wes. Macaulay, did you want to do an introduction? Go ahead.
Sure. First, I'd like to thank General Clark for opening up his opening remarks. And I want to welcome everybody that's on with us, either on Zoom or through Facebook or YouTube. And I just want to say that tonight we're presenting the two top experts on the Russo-Ukraine war. As General Clark mentioned, both him and Dr. Carver have been in Ukraine from the very beginning, okay, from 2014. They've been to Ukraine on multiple occasions. I think out of anybody in the United States, Dr. Phil Carver has probably been to Ukraine and to the front line more than anyone else. So we got the two top people here with us tonight. Also, I just want to begin this. Recently, I was in Ukraine with a delegation with the American Foreign Policy Council. We had several media experts, people from the Congressional or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and people from various non-governmental organizations. All of them experts in their field, experts on Ukraine. And just as a setup for tonight's town hall, I want to give a couple of impressions from that trip. First of all, the trip, the visit that made the most impression on the delegation as a whole was our trip to Bucha, the scene of the mass murders that the Russians committed when they were trying to take Kyiv. Bucha was occupied for approximately a little over a month. There were over 400 people murdered by the Russians there. And we were informed during our trip that there are probably about 200 such sites throughout Ukraine. Okay. It was very moving, very sobering. And what was the most interesting is our meeting with the local mayor of the deputy mayor of Bucha. And we asked her, how can we help? And we expected, an answer saying, well, we need this for reconstruction. We need that for reconstruction. And the first words out of her mouth was, we need more weapons. Our citizens from Bucha are fighting on the front line in Bucha right now. And that's a sentiment that we heard echoed throughout all our meetings, whether they were with the national government, whether they were with the local government, or with civil society activists. Everybody said we need weapons right now to win this war. Otherwise, as the deputy mayor of Bucha said, we're going to be subject to a genocide. She coined a perfect phrase. She said that Putin wants Ukraine without Ukrainians, and he's willing to do anything that he can to get rid of Ukrainians, terrorize them, murder them, push them out, and that's what we're facing right now. Also, the next impression that I had is that this is truly a people's war. Everybody is involved in this. Everybody has put aside all their differences. I said this the other day at a town hall in Union, New Jersey. You know, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or Muslim or an atheist or Jewish in Ukraine, whether you speak Russian or Ukrainian or whatever language, you know, fat, short, white, black, gay, straight, everybody is united around fighting and winning this war. And that was very evident in the meetings with civil society and with talking to just regular people on the street. And everybody's united in the 4 points here that General Clark brought up. Russia out, and that includes Crimea, war crimes, war crime tribunals, reparations, and security guarantees for Ukraine, real security guarantees for Ukraine, so that this doesn't happen again. The subject matter of tonight's meeting, Every War Must End, is extremely timely. There have been a lot of discussions, and there's been a lot of people who are participating in these discussions that are saying, well, Ukraine should just give up land and negotiate and just stop it where it is. I got a call from various well-known civil society activists yesterday when we were at our protest in Washington. I stepped away as it was snowing, and they're up in arms that there's a new wave of Western leaders, Western pundits, newspaper articles. There are some newspaper articles in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, basically saying, you know something, Ukraine has to trade land for peace. And every war must end. As General Clark pointed out, every war ends in a negotiation. And the question is, what type of negotiation will this be? And I believe we have to listen to the 2 best experts in the United States on this. And that's what we have for tonight. So I'm passing it off to my dear friend, and I hope I could consider him a colleague, Dr. Phil Carver.
Thanks, McCullough. You can call me a colleague anytime.
Thank you.
So I'm going to try and pick up where General Clark has left off, and you'll see that he jumped right to the bottom line, as he usually does. I'm going to kind of work my way slowly and provide a little bit of background for if what happens is in terms of negotiation is driven by the battlefield. What is the current state of the battlefield and the war as we see it? Andrea, if you would do the next slide for me. So 24 months into the Russian invasion, if you look at the upper left-hand slide, there was the initial assault, which was in danger of literally running over the country east of the Dnieper, and was decisively stopped at Kiev. And the units were so beat up, the Russian units were so beat up, that they then swung the survivors around and had them try to influence the events in Kharkiv. And again, they got so beat up that they actually had to withdraw, being chased by Ukrainians. And then the southern offensive, they were again so stretched that the Russians began reconsolidating their defenses, each time shrinking their forces because they are of the losses that they have incurred. Next slide, McCullen. In the process of this, I think some of the statistics are very dry, but I think it's worth highlighting a couple of them. First of all, at least 80,000 Ukrainian troops are estimated to have been killed. I hope that number is lower than that, but many outside observers have concluded that, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. There's numbers all over the place, but I think at a minimum in terms of civilian killed would be about 50,000. Again, hopefully not more, but certainly could be. But it's not only the dead, it's the surviving who are permanently incapacitated with their wounds. And again, we're talking about 50 to 100,000 military and civilians to basically have to live for the rest of their lives with the injuries and wounds that they received. The Russians have been, contrary to the laws of war, have been intentionally attacking medical facilities, 138 hospitals, plus a whole series of care facilities. The infrastructure damage, 8,000 roads damaged, 12 airports, basically put out of commission, 92 factories, 7 thermal plants, plus a whole series of electrical generation plants, and 2 ports. 378 educational institutions and 764 kindergartens. And you go, really? Those are, along with the medical facilities, military targets? 250,000, 250,000 apartment buildings and private homes. Most of them are very small private homes that people, particularly in the eastern, the combat zone, have no alternative to. 8 million external refugees spread around Europe. 5 million internally displaced because of the attacks on the residential areas and people avoiding the combat zone. And 400,000 taken to Russia, including 150,000 children, presumably people who did not go voluntarily. When you look at the infrastructure impact on Ukraine, it's $1 trillion in damage. That's equivalent to roughly 5 years of the national GDP. If this war continues for another year at the same damage infliction level, we're talking about 10 years of GDP, which would take about 50 years of recovery in terms of borrowing and getting money to do reconstruction. It's a horrific financial, not only a loss, but financial burden for several generations into the future. Andrei, if you'd throw the next slide up. I think this is particularly interesting. The slide on the left shows Ukraine at night, lit up. And now, this last fall, but it's basically still the same. And dark age has descended. And it's not only in terms of electricity and light, and it's Ukrainian railroads depend on 50% of their locomotives having electrical power, which means that they can't, if these lines are interrupted, they are greatly reduced in their logistics flow. and more importantly, it's dark ages in the sense of the treatment of civilians. And as both Wes and McCullough highlighted, numerous uh, it, it, uh, civilian attacks, torture, including torture chambers with children. The stories that come out are just horrific. And it's hard for any civilized person to conceive of people inflicting that on another human being. And yet that's where we're at. Next slide, Andre. So yeah, with those losses and the need to not have them keep growing and growing, it is important to terminate the war. So as General Clark said, every war must end. It either ends in victory, defeat, or a negotiated settlement. Moreover, there's no predictable timeline on when that can happen until one side defeats the other, or they actually decide that due to mutual exhaustion to at least temporarily call it quits. So the question is how might this war end if we don't know the timing in terms of it? So I threw out three models, and I'm sure there could be 100 variations but three sort of extreme models. On the one hand, what I call an ugly Russian win. I don't think no matter how it comes out now, Russia its military has not acquitted itself with glory. If they should prevail, it'll just because they literally had more people to stick into the meat grinder than Ukraine did. It's just ugly in terms of the sacrifice of their own people, let alone all the innocent people in Ukraine. The second option is ceasefire. And you notice I call that prelude to escalating aggression. And I'll come back to that. But one has to be very, very careful. It is extremely tempting to go, oh, let's end the violence. What is to call a ceasefire? As I'll show you in a couple of minutes, every time that's happened in the past with respect to Ukraine and Russia, not only doesn't it stop the violence, when the conflict again breaks out, it is escalating at a level way beyond what it was when the ceasefire happened. And that's happened repetitively. And then last, of course, a Ukrainian miracle win. Why do I call it a miracle win? Well, miracles imply divine intervention. As Thucydides said, of the gods we know and the men we believe, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. So if there's going to be a miracle win, it's going to require the West, specifically the United States, to step up and provide the Ukrainians with the assets to decisively win and not merely feed more and more and more people, machines, and equipment into the meat grinder. I think there is something that the West can do. And I'd like to highlight that before at the end of this. Next slide, please, Andre. So at the beginning of this war, Russia mobilized and brought in Iskander missiles from all over their country. They launched, and now after over the last year, they've launched 5,000 missile attacks and 3,500 airstrikes. This includes almost 2,000 Iskander surface-to-surface missiles and their use of air defense missiles like the S-300 in a ground attack mode. It involves the Black Sea firing the Caliber missiles, the strategic bombers firing not only modern precision guided, but even cruise missiles that go back to the Cold War, which tend to not be as accurate or aren't as accurate, but nonetheless have been used against particularly civilian targets. And last but not least, 1,100 attacks by suicide drones, many of them coming from Iran. So it's a horrific amount of attacks. virtually, I know of no NATO plan or defense of any East European country, any European country that believes that they could sustain that level of attack and continue the war effort. Next slide, Andre, please. This shows the various missiles that have been used. And what's interesting is not only the amount that's already been used, but the amount that are actually remaining. So unfortunately, while the Russians have used up some of their highest precision weapons, and some of them, like the Iskander, have been used up so much that it's likely they're going to retain the last 10% of them as in a nuclear withhold, because they, like virtually many of the other missiles here, including the naval and air, are dual capable. That is, they could be armed with a nuclear weapon. So, but nonetheless, there's a very large number of missiles that could still be thrown into the breach and cause mayhem across Ukraine. Next slide. So when the Russians started mobilizing, and by the way, this chronology for the war, I think is sort of interesting. If you ask me, I do not know, but I believe that the decision was made by Putin in the summer of 2020, because in September, he met with Lukashenko in Belarus, and they began incorporating the Belarusian military, integrating it with Russian forces. Lukashenko agreed to host Russian forces if needed in his territory. Russia supplied Belarus with S-300 surface-to-air missiles, and and Belarus was the first to announce that they were going to have the quote the Zapad 2021 exercise. The Zapad exercise is sort of interesting. So, Putin likes to say, "Oh, NATO is the first to move." So NATO enlargement encroached on us. It's important to remember that yes, various countries wanted to join NATO, but why did we encourage them to? It wasn't to increase any capability against Russia. It was to teach them, to help them learn civil military relations, which they had not done for democratic institutions, which they had not done when they were members of the Warsaw Pact. And secondly, greatly reduce, by a factor of 3, their arsenals, because they couldn't afford to maintain them as new, young, emerging democracies. We did not deploy forces forward into those areas until after 1999. What happened in 1999? Putin brought back the Russian or the Soviet Cold War exercise against NATO called Zapad, meaning West. So Zapad 1999. Then he started bringing it back again in 2009. In 2013, they practiced a hybrid kind of exercise, which was very similar, like a precursor to what happened in the Donbass. 2017, they began bringing a much bigger, more robust force oriented to Ukraine and NATO, presuming it was going to be a conflict that escalated. And those exercises ended with Putin being on TV and pushing the nuclear button. And then in 2021, the Zapad exercises occurred in Belarus, both planning against NATO and Ukraine. And then the forces that were brought forward against in that exercise ended up staying or being redeployed directly to the Ukrainian border. In the process of it, Russia brought an enormous amount of units. So they have, next slide, please, Andre. They brought units from the Far East, from Central Russia, from as high up north of Murmansk, from the Baltic, from the 49th and 58th armies down in the Caucasus. So they brought all these forces in and around Ukraine. And this shows the ground forces. So Russian normal ground force strength was about 280,000 people. Not very large, actually. It's divided roughly between 40%, what they call contractors, contractee, 20% officers and or senior enlisted, and 40% draftees. So that force has now taken substantial hits. And then this fall, notoriously, Putin called up a partial mobilization of 300,000, of which at least 100,000 appear to be now in or around Ukraine. And now it appears that they're going to have an even larger mobilization, which could be full scale of up to 500,000. In the course of it, Russia has experienced those losses, and I showed them in the slide there by month as and noticeably as the front lines have stabilized in the Donbass, and the Russians have been feeding their forces into the meat grinder. Their losses have gone exponential. But in some cases, Ukraine is inflicting 25 Russian losses to every one of their casualties. More often, it's 1 to 3 or 1 to 5. So the problem is you say, okay, well, I have a platoon of 25 guys, and we're holding off these Russians, and we kill 25 Russians a day for better part of a month, and in the end, my platoon does no longer exist. Now, in reality, both sides would probably pull those units back and try and reconstitute them, but there is a limit. No matter how many casualties you inflict on the defense, that if that the meat grinder has an effect on the defensibility of the defense as well as the attacker. Next slide, please, Andre. So the way those Russians brought their forces in, and the reason I'm highlighting this is so that we can understand where the future threats may come. So going into this conflict, Russia had about 87 brigades or regiments in the case of the airborne divisions. Those units, though, with exception of professionals like the airborne, the naval infantry and so forth, most of the ground units had this combination of 40% contractor, 20% officers, and 40% draftees. The draftees were only supposed to stay for a year. Well, you hardly get trained in your military basics within a year, and then they were to be released out. So an innovation that Putin made in the Second Chechen War in 1999, again, another major turning point, was Putin said, okay, I'm not going to put the draftees into these conflicts because they're not well trained, they don't fight well, they take disproportionate casualties, and their mothers complain. So unlike contractors, many of whom come from sort of smaller minority groups in the Russian Empire who are there basically to make money, the draftees can come from all segments of society, and Russian elite don't like their sons being put in the meat grinder. So what he ended up doing is they ended up organizing so that roughly 1/3 of every brigade would be outfitted with a composite of not only infantry, but tanks, artillery, air defense. And those would be active forces and a disproportionate amount of officers. They would leave the conscripts back in their casernes, and ostensibly they could be mobilized in the future, but in any case, they weren't being submitted directly into the fight. So of 87 brigades, Russian Defense Minister Soju said that they had 180 battalion tactical groups. At least initially, 120 were brought in from all over Russia to surround Ukraine. Now, we know at least 36 have been destroyed. The open statistics at 22 have been beat up so bad they're reconstituting. Personally, I think that could be substantially higher. but also I believe they've brought some more of those battalion tactical groups in to replace them. But it means that there's a finite amount of these battalion tactical groups that they have. So the way to fix it, and now the Russians have said, wow, you know, these battalion tactical groups are too small. Having a lieutenant colonel, he's not really an expert at combined arms. He isn't able to handle a heavy artillery or organized heavy artillery strikes or close air support. So they're now sort of going backwards to these brigades. The problem is that of those 87 brigades, most of them are missing, or 2/3 of them are missing their best guys, and so their best officers to train people. So that means that you're going to have to backfill that with additional draftees and reserve officers to do it. Why is that important? Because it takes time to do that. That's not something you do in 6 weeks, 6 months. It's probably going to take the better part of the 2023. Maybe by the late summer, some of those units would be ready. In the meantime, they're sort of trying to fill in as best as they can. But if they keep that meat grinder strategy going and they aren't able to break through in another sector, they're basically going to be forced to revert to their previous structure and spend the time to build up on it. Andre, next slide. This may be a little bit hard to read, so I'll just summarize it. If you look at it, ever since 2013, the SAPOD exercise that I mentioned, there's been repeated efforts at creating a ceasefire. Minsk won in the fall of 2014. The Russians broke it in January of 2015 in a horrific winter offensive. The Minsk II was now violated with this invasion. Every time that the ceasefire is agreed to with the Russians, when it's violated, and for some reason they just can't keep an agreement, whether it's the Budapest Agreement or any ceasefire, and they argue, well, it's a matter of state, so what we say doesn't really matter. In fact, Putin actually seems to take a delight in it. Like, he looked into the cameras in the spring of 2014 and said, I don't know who those little green men are running around in Crimea. And then 3 months later on national TV, he goes, oh yeah, those were ours. I was just kidding before. This was all based on our plan, and bragging about it. So not only do they not keep an agreement, but every time they break it, it tends to escalate in a much more horrific level of combat. Why is that important? So as General Clark said, and as McCullough both said, there are voices crying, oh, stop the violence, stop the violence. Well, the problem is, and even the Russians say, oh, well, come, let's have a ceasefire. The Chinese now are saying, oh, well, let's have we'll be honest, guys, and broker a ceasefire. And of course, the French with Macron and maybe the Germans, but they can't help themselves, running to Moscow at first, begging to try and create a ceasefire. But first of all, how long will it last? Who's going to enforce it? And most importantly, who does it favor? So I would argue that both sides could use a break. Couple months. And I think Ukraine would probably actually benefit more from that just by being able to get a respite from the current violence, assuming the ceasefire held. But the longer it goes on beyond, say, late spring or early summer, the longer that ceasefire is in, the more it's going to favor the Russians, because they are taking those 500,000 guys and fleshing out the rest of their force structure. Next slide, please. So, it's miraculous in a way what the Ukrainians have already done. So when people say, gee, well, a win would be a Ukrainian miracle, well, they've already pulled off a couple. One of which is being able to survive, and secondly, is the expanding their force. So 2/3 of the units shown in this slide were not active at the beginning of this campaign, and they have since been called up. The problem is that with reserve units, you need to be able to equip them and with modern equipment. And unfortunately, many of those reserve units that were to be mobilized did not have a full complement of artillery and armor and so forth. Likewise, the guys who are there in green in terms of the territorial brigades, National Guard brigades, National Guard regiments, all those units are basically light infantry. I mean, they have some machine guns, maybe they have some light mortars. And once in a while, they are loaned or given a javelin platoon or an in-laws platoon. But basically, they're light infantry. And the problem is they were originally designed for rear area security across the country. Next slide, Andre. As you can see from this slide, they used to be all over the country, basically in 30 major urban areas. Well, they are now needed at the front. So the forces that are in line of contact involve not only the active force, but a large number of these territorials and National Guard, all of which is good, but it means there's a limited reserve available. By the way, on both of these charts, I'm using them for illustrative purposes. I don't believe in showing they're all based on open source information that's already been published. So next slide, Andre. So how could they do a win? I'm just being hypothetical here, but I think it's worth asking ourselves, what can Ukrainians do if they're not going to merely try to outgrind the Russians? Because most of us believe that that's probably a losing approach. So that means that they have to maneuver. They have to essentially do what they've done 3 times in the Battle for Kiev, Battle of Kharkiv, Battle of Kherson, the 3 Ks. 3 times they have conducted a major counterattacks or even a mini counteroffensives, and they certainly have it within them if they have the assets. And everybody's and the Ukrainians go, we're running out of tanks, we're running out of we need more artillery. Infantry fighting vehicles are, by my count, maybe 2/3 of all the infantry fighting vehicles that they started the war with or APCs are gone. Now, just more are coming, but still not enough to even replace those losses, let alone give them a decisive counterattack. So having new weapons is helpful, but not if the tanks that are that we promised, the M1 tanks, are waiting for new production, which means they won't even be there till 2024. And the other Europeans are parsing it out, 6 tanks here, a dozen there. It is not the way to provide an effective counteroffensive force. But there is another option. And that option is providing the Ukrainians with the deep attack weaponry that would allow their maneuver forces to exploit their strikes and be able to break through and get into the Russian rear area and prevent the Russians from counterattacking them, or at least reducing their counterattack capability. That construct was actually developed by an old friend of mine back in the 80s, General Don Starry, called Air-Land Battle. And the Ukrainians essentially know how to do it. And they've done a wonderful job with the HIMARS and the systems. The problem is that we have not given them the longer range. So 100 kilometers just doesn't get it done. You need to go back about 300 kilometers to have a truly effective strike force. Why? Well, for one thing, Ukrainians have virtually a minimal air force left. They have minimal air defenses left, so they can't use air defense missiles in a ground attack mode. They don't have enough aircraft to successfully do a air to ground offensive. and people are still debating whether they're even going to be allowed to get any Western airplanes or not. And a few Patriots are focused on major strategic areas like Kiev, which is where they ought to be. So the question is, how do you get the ground forces to and that's, if there's one single weapon, and there is no such thing as a miracle weapon, but there is such a thing as a missing link. And the missing link to Ukrainians being able to conduct a successful counteroffensive is what they keep asking for, and that's called ATACMS. And this is my last slide, Andre. So the ATACMS is an American-made missile. It can be fired from the same basically launcher as the HIMARS, but it goes about enough range so that it can engage targets in the rear. One of the reasons why we have not, the United States, the Biden administration has been very explicit. We do not want to escalate. Okay, fair enough. And they've been very chary about about not wanting Ukraine to hit Russian pre-war, that's pre-2014 territory. Okay, so therefore we don't want them to have airplanes. We don't want them to have long-range missiles. Well, is there a way to square this circle? And I think there is, and that is the Ukrainians already have kept their promise not to have the HIMARS, the shorter range HIMARS, engage any targets inside Russia proper. If they agreed to, as you see in the slide, keep the ATACMS missile west of the Dnieper and below the 20th parallel, basically they're not in range of Russian territory, and yet they hold all of Crimea. All of Crimea can be held hostage, as well as the Strait Bridge, as well as targets in the Donbass, and also going into Belarus, where there are staging areas, and the Russians are currently redeploying forces along with aircraft and attack helicopters. So the point is that no, there is no single magic weapon, but if Ukrainians had our ATACMS, they could in fact do what General Clark suggests, and that is be able to change the battlefield dynamics and present to the aggressor deep concern about whether they're likely to lose a lot more in the process. Anyway, Andre, that's my summary. I apologize for running on with too many slides, but General Clark and I thought it was worthwhile highlighting both why the Russians are hurting and their mobilization potential, but also there's a long list of things Ukraine needs. But if there's one that would really provide the combined arms link that they need right now for a counteroffensive, it would be the ATACMS. And hopefully people in the diaspora and people who are supporters of Ukraine will highlight that to the U.S. administration and get them to do it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carver. I know that Mykola is still on, and I think the general is still in transit. It's a good time now to tell people that if there are specific questions, they can add them into the Q&A or the chat. We do have a fair amount of people also viewing online, as Mykola mentioned, through Facebook and Zoom. But Mykola, I don't know if you have maybe a question to start off.
So, Andre, while we're waiting for the questions, I'd like to come back in and just underscore a couple of things that Dr. Carver said.
Absolutely, sure.
I think you've got to put my video back on.
Okay. Can you turn it on now?
I'm trying. Says the host has asked me to start it, but did it start?
Not yet. Oh, there you are. There you are. Okay.
Okay. So, so look, here's the thing. The U.S. policy has been, of course, we've done a great job keeping NATO together. Putin probably figured he could count on the Germans or somebody or the French to not help at all. Okay, everybody's helping a little bit, but there's a big difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in there. So people in Eastern Europe understand what the threat is. People in Western Europe sort of wish the whole thing would go away. And so as a result, the consensus has been dribbling out assistance. and I mean dribbling it out. I think we've given a total of 180 tubes of 155 from the United States to Ukraine. But look, that's a 600-mile front. 180 tubes. That's 8 or 9 U.S. battalions. It's just very, very marginal. What the Ukrainians need is 500 tubes, 500 tanks, and the ATACMS, and 1,000 or more armored fighting vehicles to get this offensive underway. And as Dr. Carver was trying to say, the longer this goes on, the greater the chance that Russia will, either through production or through its allies, China, Iran, and North Korea, bring in sufficient power to overwhelm Ukraine. The other consideration, of course, is Ukraine's economy. The Russians are blowing the hell out of it. And as Dr. Carver told you, it doesn't matter to Putin whether he has an economy or people. He just wants the land. He figures he can shuffle populations around and get the West to finance the reconstruction if he takes it over. That's Putin. So we've got a window of opportunity here. We've got to dramatically increase the rate of assistance that we're providing. And that means taking risks with our own stockage levels. Certainly it means giving them the ATACMS, Switchblade 600 drones, not the 300. That drops a grenade on your head. The 600 takes out vehicles and warehouses, and it goes deep. And we need the Gray Eagle or the Predator kind of drone. And we're going to have to belly up on our M1A1 tanks. Yeah, they may have Chobham armor on it, okay? And maybe the Russians don't know what Chobham armor is, but it's been around for 40 years. And my guess is the Russians know very well what it is. So we got to be realistic about this. This battle is central to the future of the global structure. It's not like you can give away Ukraine and then say, but don't worry, we're going to really work against China. That won't happen. So I think Dr. Carver gave us a really good idea of what the issues are. Especially important is to note the time it takes for those 500,000 to get into the battle effectively and to be equipped and so forth. So there's a window of opportunity here, but we've got to help Ukraine take it.
Mick, do you want to ask a question, or should I just ask that first one in the Q&A? We do have one here in the Q&A asking about F-16s, F-22s. I think once you get your first delivery of presents, everybody's on to the next. So everybody's asking about it. It's been discussed in the media a lot. I don't think you specifically mentioned them in the report, in the presentation you had, Dr. Carver. So why don't we have an opinion from both of you?
So just briefly, because I think Wes can add a lot more. We've been pushing for A-10s, H-64 attack helicopters, F-16 and F-15s for before this conflict. In fact, the Ukraine's General Zabrowski and I gave a presentation here in Washington on Ukraine's needs for air in January of 2020. So this is not, the aircraft is not a new issue. Yes, there are problems with training and not only of pilots, but of ground crew. But, there are several thousand now, that make 10,000 foreign volunteers in Ukraine. Instead of them just serving in the infantry, there's no reason why you couldn't have ground crews from any one of NATO countries that have F-16s, and even some pilots to train the trainer. It ends up being it's an important issue, but it is not an unsolvable issue. The same is true also, by the way, with Western combat equipment. So the problem is, I don't think, and Wes ought to correct me, but I'm just skeptical whether we can get the air done in time and have enough of them in to make a difference.
Well, the Air Force says it takes 9 months to train a pilot for F-16. And it takes another 3 months to train them in formation so you can fly in a 4-ship formation. So you're talking about a year. So, but here's what's really bizarre about the position is if we know how long it takes, why aren't we training them now? Because when this war is finished, Ukraine is not going to be able to go back to Russia and say, okay, now I'd like some Su-35s now, and here's my money. That's not going to happen. They're going to be on Western equipment, and that means American equipment, NATO standard equipment, and that means they're going to have to be trained for it anyway. So you may as well start that training program right now on the F-16s. The A-10s, certainly we should be helping on the A-10s. And maybe it doesn't take 9 months. Maybe you could get a squadron in there quickly. But the fact is that you need those aircraft as a mobile reserve in the case of a Russian breakthrough, which is still a possibility in Donbass. And you certainly need them in terms of deep strike going after Russian formations in the second echelon when Ukraine attacks south. They'd be very, very useful.
That's in the that was in one of your slides. You said, Dr. Carver, that it wasn't anything that you're privy to, but you showed a 3-phase attack, and I believe General mentioned that the second phase, for those of you who remember the presentation, which will be linked, you can download that if you can't rewind the video on YouTube, etc. But that was something that you mentioned, Dr. Carver, in your presentation, correct?
Yes, it is. Yeah, exactly.
We have another question regarding sanctions. I don't know who would like to take this, but the question is directed at both of you, and it has to do with the effect of the Russian and Belarusian economies. Do they deserve another round of sanctions, even harder sanctions? It seems that the sanctions on Russia can make a difference, but we aren't seeing sanctions affecting the Russian economy as much as was hoped.
Wes, why don't you take that?
So, first of all, it looks like Russia's GDP is going to grow in 2022 by 0.3%. They've sold their oil. It's going out through India. It's going into the Gulf. It's often blended with other oil. The sanctions aren't effective on it. And so they're still getting money in. They're working with the Iranians and the Chinese to pull in high technology stuff that they need. What the sanctions haven't done is they haven't really helped the third world. In fact, or the global south has been hurt more by the war than the Russians have because of the inflation and the cost of energy and grain. So I think the sanctions have been remarkable in terms of the consensus that was and the effort that was required to put them on. I think it's a great thing to wean Europe off Russian energy. But I think in terms of thinking that the sanctions are a magic bullet to end the war, no. And I think that the sanctions the impact will actually decrease over time as they find ways to blow through the sanctions. Now, I'm not surprised it hasn't made that much of a difference in the Russian economy because the Russian economy is, except for maybe St. Petersburg and Moscow, it's pretty much a local and regional economy. It grows food, it produces goods, and the West is not that much involved in it. And so maybe there's been a problem pulling people out of Yakutia, and maybe that hurts the harvest there. But by and large, they're not going to be impacted the way, let's say, Western Europe would be impacted by comparable economic hardship. So I don't think we can put too much weight on the sanctions. I think it's a good consensus building issue, but you've got too many countries helping Russia evade for it to have a decisive impact.
Mick, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. I have a question to our presenters here. The Poles were willing to give several squadrons of MiG-29s, and these MiG-29s have been deeply modernized to NATO standards. They could actually carry the the NATO missiles, which is very important for the Ukrainians, the air-to-air and the air-to-ground missiles. Now, from what I understand, and I believe these are some Polish officials that we met with, these MiGs are in Germany right now, and they've been in Germany for several months, for almost from the beginning of the war, because the Poles were ready to give these over right away. What is the holdup with sending these MiGs to Ukraine? Ukraine has plenty of pilots who could fly them, and they would be able to use the NATO munitions that would give them that reach that they need. What is the holdup?
Bill, you want to take that?
Not really, because it's pretty ugly.
Okay.
But chime in, Wes, because I assume that the holdup is Poland has essentially been threatened by Russia that if they supply these, Russia will hold them responsible. So they wanted to have, and it's a legitimate request, other NATO countries to participate, and so presumably Germany was going to help us along with some of the other East Europeans, and but also I believe part of the and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Wes, but I think part of the deal was we're giving the Poles F-16s, and so we may have also made it contingent about, hey, if you want our F-16s to replace half of the Polish Air Force right now is roughly F-16 and half MiG, and so you say, okay, well, if you want to get the rest of your Air Force and F-16s, and follow our rules. I don't know, Wes.
Bill, I think that's a good explanation. But behind that explanation lies this: the Biden administration can't get consensus from NATO and may not itself want to provide fighter aircraft, which could be used, because they don't think it's necessary. As I said in my opening remarks, there's still the idea that these Russians, these Ukrainians, they're just going to have to bleed themselves out. Pretty soon they'll get so tired that they can't hold up the 16-ounce gloves in the ring, and they'll just say, okay, forget it. And it's a very naive approach, and it's going to backfire on the West if we don't come up with a better strategy. But the F-16s are they're being held hostage to that approach. Now, if the United States really wanted them to have it, they'd have it. And this brings up, Phil, something that I'd like your opinion on. But I think it's time that the United States stop allowing Russia to view itself as a sanctuary from which Ukraine can be attacked. This is a policy that's going to produce failure ultimately. No matter what the escalation potential is, you can't fight and win a battlefield if you can't isolate the battlefield. Not only ATACMS, but going beyond the boundaries of Ukraine to strike at the communications hubs, the railroads, the factories, the airfields in Russia that are supporting the conflict. Push the conflict zone deeper. That's the answer. And if it results in a certain destruction of the Russian economy, that's fair and proper. And Mr. Putin's going to have to accept that. I mean, why are we allowing Russia to savage Ukraine without requiring or without enabling Ukraine to strike back at Russia? It's bizarre, honestly. It's as bad a policy as we implemented in the Balkans in the 1990s when we told the Bosnian Muslims that they couldn't defend themselves. We put in a UN protective force. We took their weapons away, and then the UN protective force couldn't protect them. We had 7,000 Muslim men slaughtered after Srebrenica when the Serbs took it and the Dutch battalion couldn't stand up to the Serb assault. And that was a direct result of the same kind of fuzzy-headed thinking. So time for this policy to change. Russia can't be a sanctuary. Sorry, Mr. Putin.
So
I love it.
I could not agree more. I think it would be wise to at least try the ATACMS now, because they can be used, and they can also be used against Belarus, and they can be used against Crimea and the supply routes coming in through the Donbass and along the Azov. So if you use those right now, you might not have to go further. But waiting in an ironic way, if you don't do that now, eventually you're going to have to be driven to attacking Russian territory if Ukraine is going to survive.
I'd like to bring in for the next question somebody who was here last year with us as well for asking questions, and that's UCCA's Vice President and the Director of our Washington Bureau, Michael Saukyu. Michael, I know you and Mikola were just at the big rally all day yesterday, so thank you for joining us tonight. And I know you have a question.
Thanks, Andre. General, it's great to see you again. Dr. Carver, you as well. So I'm in Washington, D.C. We just had a wonderful rally of support, Stand With Ukraine in Washington, D.C. yesterday, about 2,000 and 2,500 people. And a lot of the people that came to this rally in D.C. were from throughout various parts of the country. Tomorrow, Congress is coming back into session. They were off for 2 weeks for President's Day recess. Many congressional delegations on a bipartisan basis actually went to Ukraine, in particular, some freshman members of Congress as well. A question that came from a lot of these participants during the rally yesterday, and that we're hearing throughout the Ukrainian community, is there's what's called this group of 10 or 11 in the House of Representatives. Those that constantly are voting against Ukraine or have even said that they won't support Ukraine in the future. There seem to be a few members of the United States Senate that are vying in that particular direction as well. What type of insight and or what type of recommendations could you suggest on how to tackle that group of 11 in the House of Representatives plus the few that are in the Senate right now?
Bill, you want to go ahead?
Oh, okay. Well, all right. So, it just so happened that I knew Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater and John McCain, and they knew me personally. They all have to be rolling over in their collective graves at the direction the Republican Party has taken in recent time. You can't find a level of isolationism and weirdness unless you go back to the pre-World War II, and that didn't exactly work out so well either. Mr. Saki, you may remember that we were having lunch together at a restaurant on Capitol Hill when General Zabrowski was here.
Right.
And in the corner was a Fox commentator, essentially taking notes from a Russian. And I think I think we have to hit back a lot harder than we have in terms of pointing out that part of it is talking points that are relayed via the media, but part of it is people who are caught up in their own domestic issues, and then they're trying to turn it. I found it disgraceful. For example, I'm a lifetime Republican, or at least I used to be. I don't know what the hell I am now with this crowd. But when President Biden goes to Kiev, and what does Governor Perry say? Oh, well, he ought to be visiting our border. I mean, come on. That's just a cheap shot, a political gambit, and it bears no resemblance to reality. It's just, and frankly, I'm sick and tired of it. So I think we need to call it. I think also one other thing we need to do is reach out. And by the way, General Clark and I got together in 2014 because we wanted to do it as a bipartisan effort. I remember we were at the front, I think it was in right after the Winter Offensive in 2015. And General Clark turns to me, he says, Phil, the current level of partisanship, and that was it, it's we've worse now. The current level of partisan antics had existed in the Cold War, we wouldn't have won. I believe that in my soul. And I think we've got, with respect to Ukraine, we have to create a bipartisan consensus that is focused on reality and get rid of the silly politics. Over to you, Wes.
Well, first of all, I'd like to see the Ukrainian American group organized more regionally. So there've been a lot of demonstrations. There's been a lot of support over this weekend in various cities. We have to keep it coming. We have to bring people from the battlefront back to the United States. They need to go out and brief Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs. They need to go into rural America, not just the poverty, not just the policy people, but they don't. They think they can solve things in Washington. You can't. So you got to go to Kansas. You got to go to Indiana. You got to go to Ohio and Arkansas, and you got to make your case in the local newspapers. Look, Israel has been doing this for 70 years. Israel has been doing it for 70 years, and it's worked pretty well for Israel. Ukraine needs to do this now. Ukraine's is a society that is going to be eradicated if Putin wins. So we need a lot more person-to-person outreach. At some point, the president's going to have to address the American people, but he did so well in Ukraine and Poland, and before that, in the State of the Union, that we probably 2 or 3 months down the line, we've got to do this. Got to stay active with the supporters on the Hill. They need to be given fresh information. They need to be meeting people. They need to have their batteries recharged periodically. That's the basic way American politics works. And whether we like it or not, the United States is one of the centers of gravity of this conflict. Putin certainly knows it, and he knows that if he can turn the Republican Party inside out, get it to block assistance to Ukraine, the war will be over shortly. So we can't take anything for granted in the United States. We've got to have strong support, and that means eyewitness accounts from the battlefield. And there's not enough of that. But I like to see some of these wounded veterans coming out of the fights that are recovered, the people that have been brought to the United States for surgery and others. I'd like to see a speakers program set up. I'd like to see them taken around the country. I'd like to hear their thoughts about this, person to person, to the American people. That's my strongest recommendation.
General, I think that's a great recommendation. And frankly speaking, this has been done before. You had mentioned in terms of Israel doing this, but frankly speaking, the 3 Baltic countries did this prior to them getting into NATO. They had their supporters in Washington, D.C., but they knew that they had to get the support from the average American citizen outside of the Beltway. And that's exactly what they did. They went out into Middle America. They went out to one coast to another coast, and they had their, not necessarily rallies, but they had their discussions in town hall type meetings with average American citizens, trying to get them to understand the need for the Baltic states to be in NATO, what that brings for NATO, and obviously in terms of the larger security concerns of Russia back then. We're talking 2014. So much in terms of examples that have been done can actually be brought forth in terms of what is happening right now. And to that degree, I'd like to mention that we have our Ukrainian Days advocacy program that's coming up on March 8th and March 9th. And for that particular purpose, I hope you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
It's
Yeah.
coming. It's coming.
I see a Clip Champ. Microsoft Clip Champ, is that what you got?
I apologize. I don't know what happened here. Let me try
Alright.
one more time.
Aim for the right one, yeah.
We have an advocacy event coming up on March 8th and March 9th, where we have so many people coming in from throughout the country, and We had one in November of last year, right before the crucial $40 billion vote for Ukraine. And interestingly enough, members of Congress, to your point, General Clark, members of Congress had actually said that, yes, you don't need to persuade me since I'm already on your side. We have to go back into the various communities, and in those various communities, that's where we have to make our point known. So I take that, and I'm very grateful for your suggestion. And I think for that particular purpose is exactly what is going to be necessary come our advocacy event on March 8th and March 9th. And as we go forth, there's some congressional legislation that's out there already, in particular, recognizing the Wagner Group as a foreign terrorist organization. I think that's very important because my interaction with congressional officers are telling me that this could be the next step in terms of eventually or potentially recognizing Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. If you have Russia obviously as looking to get assistance from North Korea in terms of armaments, from Iran in terms of armaments, those two countries themselves are state sponsors of terror. So there's the one obviously does coincide with the other here. And one last thing that I'd like to mention as well is we from the UCCA and from the Ukrainian National Information Service in Washington, its bureau in Washington, D.C., have actually advocated with not just sitting members of Congress, but former members of Congress. And with those former members of Congress, we've actually formed a Congressional Ukraine Advisory Group. And the Congressional Ukraine Advisory Group is of former members of Congress that will help us as a Ukrainian American community to advocate for stronger U.S.-Ukraine relations right now. They are throughout all parts of the United States. And they could do that exactly what we are just mentioning in terms of bringing this argument to the rest of the United States, to the rest of the citizens of the United States. We can do things in Washington together, but also we can do things as well throughout the rest of the country. So we have close to about 20 members, former members of Congress already, senators and congressmen alike. Senator Portman, recently retired Senator Portman from Ohio, has agreed to co-chair, as well as Representative David Bonner from Michigan has agreed to co-chair. So this is on a bipartisan basis, and this is something as well as much to promote the effects and the objectives of getting as much assistance to Ukraine as necessary right now to win the war, to win it victoriously, obviously, but to win it in a very swift and favorable manner.
So if I could jump in on that, I think it isn't just about Ukraine. It's about East European security. And I know that the various diaspora groups have reached out, but we need to start the Swedes, the Finns, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia. Those countries are directly threatened, and they have large populations, or they have a lot of friends in the United States. We need to create a united front, and not just make it about. I'm not taking anything away what's already being done, but I think the next layer has to broaden it, create a true united front.
That Dr. Carver, that exists in a sense with our interaction with various Central and Eastern European communities in the United States. There are 10 million Poles. There are at least 1 million Balts in the United States, and so forth and so on. And we've already formed for the past decade plus the Central and Eastern European Coalition. So we're all in this together. And frankly speaking, for the Polish American Congress, for their community, it's just as important for Ukraine to win the war because it affects their security interests in Poland as well. So we're all in this together, and we're reaching out, and we're doing other types of outreach to other ethnic communities, not necessarily from Central and East Europe, but those that understand what it means to be under authoritarian regimes, and frankly speaking, what it means to
Are you
be
still on the phone?
And that I think is going to
You said an hour. It's an hour and a half almost.
in many of our discussions.
As usual.
We also have a couple of questions left. I know we're at like 10 minutes till 8:30 here. Why don't we do a couple of rapid fire from the end of this chat, just so we can make sure everybody's been responded to. First question has to do with nuclear weapons. I know that the President Putin has been talking about nuclear retaliation since at least the promise of air defense to Poland.
What did I say?
So we'll see. Okay, what is your response to the what is your response to the threat of nuclear weapons if the United States were to give more aid?
Phil, I'll take this
Yeah, please.
to start. Yeah, I think it's very possible that Putin could use nuclear weapons. I mean, he's got the heavy artillery launchers there. He could have them air delivered. He could do things with nuclear weapons, but I don't think that's his inclination. I think if we give Ukraine the systems it needs, what Ukraine can do is threaten Crimea, get into Crimea through those offensives, and bring Putin to the bargaining table. Putin will play it long. He'll believe that he can out negotiate the West, do another Minsk III, even if he has to pull back, and he wants to rebuild his forces. So I don't see him using nuclear weapons, but I don't think you can discount it entirely. If he does, we've said it's an entirely different situation. It would be at that point. There's no doubt about it.
Phil?
But yeah, I completely agree as usual. But I would add that we don't know. So Russia has a substantial nuclear arsenal. You know, in the early 1990s, the U.S. basically got rid of its tactical and theater systems, except for 400 B-61 gravity bombs, which several hundred are deployed towards NATO. The Russians kept several thousand of theirs, and so including modernizing them in the interim. So, they have, certainly, as we saw with all those missiles, most of which are nuclear capable. So they have enough stuff to make the rubble bounce, and they may be tempted. But and I don't know what our response would be. I kind of doubt whether our first response would be a nuclear response, but I honestly don't know. And in a way, I don't really want to speculate. I think, though, that the same is true for Putin and his coterie. They go, well, yeah, that sounds pretty good, but what if? And once you let these things out, one thing we know is when they start going off, you want to see escalation. It tends to deal. And oh, by the way, the winds blow east, so whatever radiation you're dumping on Ukraine is coming back to you. So I think I agree with Wes. I think there's a strong inhibition of doing it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be very, very tough and vigilant on that issue.
I think one final question for tonight would be the China question. We've had a couple of comments online, and both I see one in the chat as well, regarding probably what was reported just earlier last week, that that China has been aiding with non-lethal, non-military support for Russia. What happens when that changes? What are we talking about? Sanctions? I know that there was a report over the weekend that Secretary Blinken warned China that sanctions could be put upon China if that's the case. Is that the next step? Oh, sorry, General, can you unmute yourself? Sorry.
I think sanctions would be the next step. I'm not sure what those sanctions would be, but we do know that the Chinese economy is very closely connected to ours and to Asia. So it's not a good thing to contemplate. If China comes in, then it's that much more reason to take off the cloak of Russia, because you're going to have to reach back into the Russian supply chains, logistics chains, and so forth, to block those supplies coming forward. So you need greater depth on the battlefield. So it's definitely an escalation. It's going to be an escalation, sanctions wise and military wise, if they come in.
Dr. Garber.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize there's sort of three different ways the Chinese can participate. One is with high-tech components, another is with munitions, and the other is with systems. The munitions would be an easy next step for them. I mean, they can load up boxcars. There's dozens of trains traveling across the Trans-Siberian every day, and from China with goods. They can load those trains up and have tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, because the Chinese have the same artillery system as the Russians do, the 152 millimeters. And they have some advanced munitions, and then they have a hell of a lot of old dumb munitions, which the Russians use with mass effect. So I think, in some ways, I think that is the one to kind of watch, because it's going to be very hard to verify until it's already sort of happening.
Very, very direct and to the point, both of you gentlemen. Mikola, how are we doing on time? I think we've perhaps overstayed our welcome with our wonderful guests, but I know that everybody was so eager to hear from them both. I don't know if you have a wrap-up question for either of them.
It's not a wrap-up question. It's a wrap-up comment, basically. And when our first meeting with that we had with a Ukrainian on our trip, it was actually in Poland, and it was with Hanna Hopko, which I believe all of you know. And she's doing a wonderful job in presenting the Ukrainian case as a civil society activist. And she posed a question to our delegation. At that time, the Ramstein conference had ended, and there was no decision on tanks, so the decision was essentially negative. And she basically said, does the West realize that it might be too late? At one point, it's going to be too late to help Ukraine. Does everybody realize this in the West? Where a decision will be made to give tanks several months down the line, but it'll be too late because the situation has changed on the battlefield. All right, and there's another comment that some of the security officials said. They said, well, because by the time we got to Ukraine, it was midweek, and there were all these declarations that all these countries are going to be giving tanks and all. And one security official said it took 7 months to make that decision. Tens of thousands were killed in those 7 months. That was a very, very stark statement to make. Those two statements really stuck in our heads. And this is something, we have online our activists, the people who are going to be participating at Ukraine Days. We're all veterans of that. We go and talk to our congressmen and senators, and it's extremely important that we be all well informed. That's why seminars like this are very important. Our activists have to have the latest information, and they have to be able to say, well, I heard this from an authoritative source at this and this seminar. We're going to be also running another seminar on the 2nd of, on the 28th of February. This is Tuesday. This is our Ukraine Security Dialogue. General Clark will be participating in that. And that's a whole day event. And that's live and also online. So I encourage all our activists to sign up, to come down to Washington to take part, and to learn more information, exactly what you're supposed to tell your congressman, what you're supposed to tell the newspaper people that are going to get in touch with you and all. So that's basically about it. I would like to thank everybody. I really I want to thank Michael for coming in, because the work that we do as a community is extremely, extremely important. Last year, we had our seminar, Warning of War. This was at the end of December, just a couple of months before the war started. Okay, and we got our activists primed and ready to go. and we see that all these efforts of Ukraine getting the amount of aid that it's getting now, it was a combined effort between the expert community, which is represented by Dr. Carber and General Clark, and also the work of our diaspora in the United States, who have been doing this advocacy on a remarkable level. Just to inform everybody, I myself am a Ukrainian American Republican and conservative, and I'm appalled at what's going on with our party. And I know there's a group of us, Ukrainian American Republicans, that are working to counteract that. Okay, and we're working with our non-Ukrainian American friends, and I'll just let you know, one of the members of our delegation was a conservative commentator, Brett Bozell. Okay, and he has a following on Facebook of several million people. Okay, and he's been active. He's been going since our return at the beginning of February. He's been going to various conservative events and explaining what he saw. And he has a lot of credibility in the conservative community, and that's a very important thing that we're doing to get this off the ground. Brett Bozell is the one right in the middle over there in the screen with the glasses. So we have to do it all. And the advice that General Clark and Phil give us on what we need to do is immense. Last year, the advice was have Putin declared a war criminal. Okay, it's taken us almost a year, and we're almost there. But Antony Blinken's statement on Russian war crimes in Ukraine and the Vice President Kamala Harris's statement on war crimes, extremely strong, extremely strong. And these are the messages that we need to push out. And again, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Andriy for running all of this and all his work that he does. He's constantly on the TV, on the local television in New York, telling everybody the truth about Ukraine. You have Mike Saukiu, who does a wonderful job in Washington in organizing these Ukraine days. It's an immense undertaking, and we all need to support that. And I want to thank Dr. Phil Carber and General Wesley Clark, who've been there from the very beginning. Okay, who've been there. They got into Ukraine before a lot of us did, and they've been to places, that we can only imagine. And they come back and they give the expertise. I know they've advised the Obama administration, they've advised the Trump administration, and they're advising this administration on what needs to be done. So thank you, everybody. And I don't know, Mike or Andriy or Phil, do you have any last words that you'd like to say?
I believe that you mentioned everything that's coming up. Thank you, Mikhailo. For those of you who don't get UNICEF's action alerts, you can look them up on UCCA.org's website. There you'll see the registration for Ukrainian Days. You'll see the registration for the conference that Mykola mentioned. I will mention that the last time we're going to be back at the National Press Club, we change venues every year for this security dialogue. The last time we were at the Press Club was when, and Dr. Carber was there, we were having a discussion. This was back in 2018. I believe that we had this discussion about the naval sphere will be the next part of the battle in Ukraine. And 6 months later, we had the incident with Ukrainian soldiers being taken hostage. after their ship was fired upon. So the security dialogue is always a rousing discussion, and it's often full of people who are looking far ahead at the next sphere. During the pandemic, it was during the security dialogue where we actually had members of the California Air Guard talk about their training of Ukrainians. That's still available online, so you can see what that's about. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. Michael will be organizing the Ukrainian Days the following week. And then there is plenty more advocacy to do. Use the information that Dr. Carber has provided today. We will include in the email for all those registered today Dr. Carber's presentation, because everybody always asked me immediately after. I didn't catch it. So we will make sure that everybody has those maps and use those to your advantage. This is information, as Dr. Carber and General Clark said, this is information for you, no matter where you are in the country, to present to your local elected officials and try to gain more support for Ukraine. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And again, the follow-up emails will come automatically tomorrow.